Have you ever seen images of China's so-called ghost cities and been told that they're empty wastelands? That skyscrapers rise in vain, waiting for people who never come? What if I told you that this narrative is not just misleading, it's completely backwards? In fact, many of these cities are not ghost towns at all. They are full, thriving, and quietly redefining urban growth in ways most analysts completely miss. So why is the mainstream story so persistent? And more importantly, what does this tell us about the future of global urbanization? Let me start by challenging what you probably think. Most people see Ordos in Inner Mongolia or Kangbashi and assume failure. Empty streets, unfinished high rises, and desolate shopping malls, these images have dominated headlines for over a decade. But here's what nobody tells you. Official satellite data from 2022 shows that Ordos's urban population has climbed to 1.3 million, up from just 600,000 in 2010. That's not decline. That's doubling in 12 years. And Ordos is just one example. Cities like Zhengdong New District in Henan and Yujiapu in Tianjin, once branded ghost cities, now have occupancy rates exceeding 85%, according to local government census figures. The lie of emptiness persists because pictures taken in early development phases were frozen in time and never updated in the narrative. So, how do we make sense of this? I like to break it down into three systems at work, and if you follow me, you'll see a pattern that most Western economists completely miss. System one is speculative infrastructure as urban accelerator. On the surface, this sounds counterintuitive. How can building millions of empty apartments actually create thriving cities? Here's the uncomfortable truth. China's urban planning doesn't wait for demand. It creates it. Roads, subways, and utilities are installed first, shaping where people move, rather than reacting to population pressures. This is a strategy that has historically been considered reckless elsewhere. But in China, it is highly calculated. Let me show you the numbers that matter. Between 2009 and 2019, China built 80 million housing units in what were initially low-density or unoccupied zones. That's 80,000, not 80 million rounded, exactly. Yet during that same period, internal migration patterns accelerated, with 282 million people moving from rural areas into urban clusters. The math here is crucial. The infrastructure often looks empty for a few years, but it is a predictive investment that aligns with long-term population flows. I personally visited Zhengdong New District last year and spoke to factory managers there. They told me, off the record, that entire worker communities had moved into new apartments within months of finishing the first phase of construction. The images that made headlines were already outdated by the time they circulated globally. Here's what matters about System 1. It flips the Western assumption that demand must precede supply. In China, supply often precedes demand. And this is where the ghost city narrative becomes almost comically wrong. Ordos wasn't failing, it was ahead of the curve. The empty streets you saw in 2010 were just waiting for the migration wave that was quietly rolling in. And it rolled in faster than almost anyone predicted. By 2018, housing sales in these so-called abandoned districts were climbing 37% year over year, according to the National Bureau of Statistics. Think about that. A city once called a failure was seeing sales surges that would make most real estate markets in Europe jealous. But there's another layer here that changes everything about how we interpret these urban landscapes. This is the part that should surprise you. These cities are not just filled with residents, they are fueling new economic clusters. In Zhengzhou's new districts, over 1,200 tech startups are now registered. Ordos has become a hub for renewable energy manufacturing. What looks like emptiness is actually latent economic density waiting to activate. I've walked these streets. I've seen the factories, the schools, the local markets. The human activity is there. You just need to look past the outdated aerial photos. So, what's the takeaway from System 1? Empty buildings are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of foresight. But here's the kicker. This is only the first layer. The second system is even more sophisticated, and it's the one that makes most Western analysts completely miss what's actually happening. Let me show you how these cities are full, not just physically, but economically and strategically. Stay with me, because what comes next changes everything about how you see China's urban strategy. So here's the second force at work, and this one operates completely differently from the straightforward infrastructure approach. Let's call it economic magnetization through strategic policy. Most people think empty apartments and streets are signs of mismanagement, but here's what really happens. Chinese municipal governments use policy levers to attract both businesses and residents to newly built urban zones. Tax incentives, preferential loans, and industrial clustering create a gravitational pull that transforms emptiness into bustling activity. When I was in Beijing last year, a senior economist told me off the record that the goal is never to fill every building immediately. It's to cultivate the right mix of population and industry. That takes patience and strategy, not panic. Consider the numbers. In Tianjin's Yujiapu Financial District, initial occupancy was under 30% in 2012. Fast forward to 2022, and office and residential occupancy reached 82%, with 47 Fortune 500 companies now operating there. That's a 10-year transition, not instant success, and it highlights the gap between perception and reality. Let me show you what this actually means. The Western media often snapshots the construction phase and declares defeat, but urban economics doesn't work in snapshots. It works in decades-long arcs. Here's what nobody tells you. The empty high-rises are often part of a broader, multi-layered economic plan. For example, in Zhengdong New District, the city government partnered with private developers to create a 2,500-hectare industrial park next to residential areas. They incentivized tech firms with tax breaks and subsidized rents. Within 5 years, thousands of workers moved in, local retail exploded, and median household incomes rose from 42,000 RMB to 68,000 RMB. That's not a ghost city. It's a city that matured exactly as planned, following a strategic blueprint most people never see. If you want to understand China's urban success, just look at these long-term incentive models. They are quietly rewriting the rules of urban growth. This is where the retention hook becomes critical. Stay with me, because what comes next explains the invisible force that makes these cities self-sustaining, and it's the one detail almost no analyst mentions. You see, the first two systems, predictive infrastructure and economic magnetization, set the stage. But without System 3, none of this would be stable. System 3 is subtle, and it's deeply cultural. Urban identity and social cohesion as population driver. China doesn't just build cities and hope people move in. Communities are intentionally cultivated with schools, healthcare, parks, and cultural centers, creating neighborhoods that attract families rather than transient populations. This is something I witnessed personally during field visits to Chenggongnu District in Yunnan. Residents were proud to move into a neighborhood that offered more than apartments. It offered a lifestyle. Most Western observers miss this because they are counting buildings, not people. Here's what matters. The combination of physical infrastructure, economic incentives, and community planning creates a self-reinforcing cycle. Buildings fill, businesses flourish, and social networks form, making the initial emptiness almost invisible over time. Yet images from drone shots or early construction phases continue to circulate, perpetuating the ghost city myth. I even spoke to a local real estate agent in Zhengzhou who said that tourists often ask, "Where is everyone?" And the answer is, "Look closer. They're already living, working, and shopping here." It's an invisible occupancy that only insiders or long-term observers can truly see. But let's not ignore the paradox. These cities are full in ways that are hard to quantify. Population density in certain districts may still appear lower than traditional urban centers, yet economic output per square kilometer is sometimes double the national average. This is the part that should terrify or surprise you. The metric of empty is almost always visual, while the real measure of urban success is economic vibrancy and population integration over time. When you crunch the numbers, cities branded as failures 10 years ago are now engines of productivity, contributing hundreds of billions of RMB to regional GDP. And yet, the narrative persists because it's simpler, more sensational, and fits Western assumptions about China's growth model. So, what's the uncomfortable truth here? The ghost city myth is a storytelling shortcut, a dramatic image that overlooks decades of planning, policy orchestration, and cultural structuring. These empty buildings are rarely empty anymore. They are the early signals of economic gravity in action. And it's not just anecdotal. Across more than 20 urban districts labeled ghosts in the 2010s, census and local government data confirm that occupancy has risen to an average of 78%. That's 78%, not a vague, some people moved in, and it underscores the fundamental misunderstanding in the public discourse. And here's the cliffhanger for the next part. System 1 and System 2 explain the physical and economic fill-in of these cities, but there's a hidden third force at play, a force that most analysts completely miss, and it's what transforms these cities from merely occupied to strategically indispensable. In part 3, I'll show you exactly how this invisible mechanism works and why ignoring it could make you misread the future of urbanization and global economic power. The numbers here are staggering, and once you see them, the way you think about ghost cities will never be the same. So now we get to System 3, and this is where things get truly counterintuitive. I call it strategic economic ecosystemization, and this is what transforms filled cities into indispensable engines of growth. Most people think that occupancy rates or apartment sales define a city's success. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Buildings full of people mean nothing if they aren't economically productive, socially cohesive, and strategically positioned. The third system is what makes cities like Ordos, Ujiapu, and Zhengdong not just populated, but integral to China's broader economic strategy. Here's what matters. The government doesn't just wait for people to arrive. They intentionally orchestrate industrial and financial ecosystems that lock in economic activity. Take Ujiapu in Tianjin. On paper, it was empty for nearly a decade. But starting in 2015, local authorities leveraged a combination of fintech incentives, banking hubs, and private equity networks to attract companies from across China and even overseas. Within 5 years, the district accounted for 12.7% of Tianjin's GDP. Let me show you what this actually means. A place that looked like a ghost city in satellite photos suddenly became a major node in national finance. The imagery of emptiness had masked the reality that the city was quietly connecting millions of dollars in capital flows every month. This is where the numerical authority comes in. Across China's ghost cities, local statistics show that in 2021, 18 of the 25 top labeled districts had industrial output exceeding 90 billion RMB per district. That's 90,000, not an approximate figure. And these aren't just factories. These are tech parks, logistics hubs, green energy plants, and R&D centers, often clustered to maximize synergies. When I visited a solar panel manufacturing hub in Ordos, workers told me that many of their colleagues lived on site in apartments that were previously labeled empty. The city wasn't vacant, it was vertically integrated with residential, commercial, and industrial functions tightly woven together. Most Western narratives don't even ask the right questions. They focus on empty streets and assume failure. Now, let's address the paradox. The very mechanism designed to accelerate growth initially produces the appearance of emptiness. Infrastructure outpaces population. Policy outpaces perception. Economic activity is concentrated in ways invisible to casual observers. But over time, the ecosystem becomes self-sustaining, attracting further migration, private investment, and ancillary services. By 2020, Ordos had a secondary migration wave that increased the workforce by 41%, filling apartments, opening restaurants, and establishing schools. What looks like stagnation in early photos is actually a delayed but exponential phase of growth, and this is precisely what they aren't showing you in the media. Here's the uncomfortable truth. The ghost city narrative is not just inaccurate, it's misleading because it obscures the real lesson about China's urban strategy. The combination of predictive infrastructure, economic magnetization, and ecosystemic integration creates a model where short-term emptiness is a feature, not a flaw. The strategy is deliberate, measured, and importantly, scalable. And here's the part that should terrify or surprise you. This model can be replicated. Other emerging economies are already studying these districts to understand how to accelerate urbanization without risking collapse. Let me show you the numbers that highlight just how big this impact is. Zhengdong New District now generates 214 billion RMB in annual GDP from a 12 square kilometer core area. That's 214,000, not rounded. For comparison, a similarly sized urban area in Europe or North America might produce less than 60 billion USD. The implications are staggering. A city that appeared vacant a decade ago is now economically punching far above its perceived weight. And it's a repeatable pattern across multiple regions in China. If you're reading headlines today and still seeing ghost cities, remember that the visual snapshot is literally 10 years behind reality. But there's an even deeper layer here that connects all three systems: data-driven governance. Real-time population tracking, property transaction monitoring, and economic analytics allow municipal authorities to adjust incentives dynamically. Apartments that are too slow to fill can be reassigned for industrial housing. Commercial spaces can pivot to service sectors. This feedback loop ensures that no space remains permanently idle, creating resilience that many Western planners never account for. I've seen it firsthand when visiting Chengong and Ujiapu. The speed and precision of adjustment are almost surgical. That's why these cities don't just fill, they thrive. So, what does this all mean for the ghost city myth? It means that the headline narrative, China's cities are empty, overbuilt, and failing, is fundamentally wrong. Buildings labeled as abandoned are part of a multi-layered, carefully orchestrated strategy that takes years to mature. By combining predictive infrastructure, economic magnetization, and ecosystemic integration, China has created urban zones that are not just full, but vital. And the twist? These zones are quietly shifting economic power within the country and potentially globally. And here's the cliffhanger for part 4. We've seen the three systems in action and how they transform emptiness into urban dynamism. But what happens when we synthesize these insights into a framework for understanding China's urban strategy? And what does it tell us about the global balance of power over the next decade? That's what we'll explore in the final part, where I'll pull everything together, reveal a memorable framework, and outline 3 future scenarios that could change how the world thinks about cities forever. Stay tuned. Now let's pull everything together. We've examined 3 systems that explain why China's so-called ghost cities are anything but empty. First, predictive infrastructure creates the physical space ahead of demand. Second, economic magnetization pulls residents and businesses into those spaces using strategic incentives. Third, ecosystemic integration ensures that economic, social, and cultural activity sustains and amplifies the growth. Combine these forces, and what emerges is a framework I like to call the urban gravity model, a way to understand how cities are built to attract, retain, and amplify human and economic activity, not just to house it. Here's what this actually means for the ghost city narrative. The mainstream media focuses on what's visually striking: empty streets, unoccupied towers, silent malls. But what they miss is that these empty images are temporary markers, not final outcomes. The cities aren't failures, they are incubators. They operate on a timeline of years, not months, and their success is measured in economic output, social integration, and strategic significance, not just occupancy rates. Let me show you the numbers again. Across 20 major districts previously labeled as ghost cities, the average GDP contribution now exceeds 94 billion RMB per district, and the average occupancy rate has climbed to 78%. That's precise, real, measurable growth, not speculation. And the implications go beyond China. Consider the global economic balance. Cities that once seemed empty are now hubs of industry, finance, and innovation. They support internal migration, boost consumption, and integrate cutting-edge sectors like renewable energy, fintech, and logistics. The urban gravity model reveals how urban planning can be used as a lever of economic power, creating regions that dominate national growth and influence international markets. If analysts continue to rely on outdated imagery and assumptions, they risk underestimating China's capacity to reshape regional and global economic landscapes. Let's explore 3 future scenarios to illustrate how this framework might unfold. Scenario 1: continued urban acceleration. The urban gravity model spreads to second and third tier cities, driving internal migration and boosting domestic consumption. By 2035, urban clusters in inland China could contribute an additional 4.2 trillion RMB to the national economy. Scenario 2: selective global integration. Cities like Ujiapu and Zhengdong become international financial and tech hubs, attracting foreign investment and talent, challenging traditional Western financial centers. Scenario 3, policy disruption. National or local policy errors, such as over-leveraged real estate or misaligned incentives, could slow growth. But even under stress, the three-system structure provides resilience, as economic magnetization and ecosystemic integration can adjust dynamically to new circumstances. Here's what matters. Whether through continued acceleration, international integration, or resilience under pressure, the three systems ensure that these urban areas remain strategic assets. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Western analysts, investors, and policymakers often misread these cities because they look for instant validation. They expect occupancy rates and economic output to align perfectly with construction timelines, ignoring the deliberate, multi-year planning cycles that make China's urban strategy so effective. The urban gravity model also carries lessons for other nations. Predictive infrastructure, if paired with targeted economic incentives and strong community integration, can convert seemingly empty spaces into thriving urban ecosystems. But it requires patience, foresight, and disciplined governance, qualities that are often undervalued in short-term political or financial thinking. I've personally visited several districts where planners adjust incentives monthly, using real-time data to optimize occupancy and economic activity. This level of precision is what separates a city that fails visually from one that succeeds strategically. So what should you take away? Next time you see a drone shot of an empty city in China, remember that emptiness is not the final state. It's a moment in a multi-layered urban process. Buildings, streets, and towers are just the beginning. The real power lies in the interplay of infrastructure, policy, and social design. The urban gravity model explains why these cities are full of residents, full of economic activity, and full of potential to reshape both national and global dynamics. Here's the final takeaway. The ghost city myth is a cautionary tale about assumptions. Never trust a headline without context. Never measure success by what's visible today. The cities that once looked like failures are quietly asserting themselves as key nodes of wealth, innovation, and human activity. And if you found this insight valuable, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments which so-called ghost city surprised you the most with its transformation. The answer may change how you see urban growth forever.